This is your daily dose of all things royal.
Thank you from the bottom of my heart. Thank you, London.
Go and kill London! Go and kill London!
Can you please? Sadiq, just pause there, please.
Welcome back, my gorgeous, good-looking friends. Yesterday, I saw this post by Dan Wooten in which he was questioning why London had to wait over 24 hours to find out who the next mayor was going to be. Normally, for many Americans, we could care less who is elected mayor of London. Same thing, vice versa. Like, I don't think people in London really care about who's elected mayor in New York. But this post really piqued my interest because of what Dan Wooten said next. He goes, "Can we really trust that there is no manipulation of the boxes of votes? This only happens once every 4 years. Count the votes overnight." Immediately, I had flashbacks to 2020 and what the US election went through with all these mail-in ballots and questioning the validity of the count. I'm not going to get into that. I mean, I have my own feelings about it. Sadly, I'm not allowed to express that because currently right now on these platforms, there is a narrative that they do not want you talking about. Otherwise, you get penalized. This is what censorship is about. So here we are, constitutionally protected speech, and here I am afraid of voicing my opinion on what went down in 2020. I am making this a point because I want my audience to see and understand why censorship is bad and why I continue to keep talking about it and calling Meghan and Harry out. Anyhow, getting back to this, I started to look a little bit more into this. So apparently this election happened on May 2nd, and they didn't announce who won until May 4th. And online, many people expressed their disappointment, being upset that this man had got elected a third time, something I don't think happens very often. And many people are questioning the outcome because the math is not mathing. And I don't know how the election process is in the UK, but here in the United States, there is talk about allowing everyone and their mother to be able to vote in this election, whether you're legal or illegal. And you don't even have to produce ID. I don't know if that's the same in London, but I do understand that there is a mass influx of migrants coming in, and I believe, documented or undocumented, had the ability to vote if they wanted to in this local election. So could we be seeing the same thing happening here in November to where allegedly all these millions of people are flooding in for the mere purpose of swaying the vote to ensure that the uniparty is kept in power? I don't know. But it would make up a great excuse to rig an election, hence the reason why the United States should make it mandatory that you vote in person with an ID. There's furious debate right now on Capitol Hill about it, and of course, the Democrats are pushing back because they think that it makes it more difficult for people to go out and vote if they have to present ID, which makes absolutely no sense to me, but that's the argument. I don't want to go down this rabbit hole, but I just hope that someone from our Congress is paying attention to what's happening in Europe because we're not too far behind. And it's not a coincidence that all these issues that are coming up in the Western world is happening all at the same time. It's not a coincidence. And it does look like the international community, the powers that may be that want this one world government, is trying to collapse American society. A lot of the effort is focused around destroying our national identity as well as destroying the Constitution. I hope people understand that the 2016 election threw a wrench in the globalist Agenda 2030 plans. Everything that we are experiencing now, this inflation, shortage of food, farmers like protesting because they are losing their land and, just complete destruction of society was supposed to happen under the Hillary Clinton administration. And the reason why I say that is because if you look at all the Western countries, particularly the ones in NATO, the ones that we have gotten in bed with, they all have been experiencing the same problems at the same time. Now, we're experiencing the similar problems, but our problems had been delayed. So meaning right now we're seeing and feeling inflation, particularly around food. We know that this inflation or this rise in living had been going on at least a year prior with the rest of the Western world. These globalists didn't anticipate on how the internet was going to influence the election because these arrogant mother effers really thought they had control over the information and what people believed, which to a certain extent here in the United States, like I've told you before, we really didn't know what was going on with Meghan Markle that you guys were, following. We didn't hear any of that stuff. And that's because our media is more controlled than I would say than the China or North Korea. Like it is so bad here. And I truly believe that for so long, and I can see that because of how ingrained the mainstream media is and how in bed they are with our government, that you wouldn't have known any different. But it was because of the internet and the ability for independent journalists to come out and voice their own opinion that did not follow the government script to where everything was thrown off. And this is why you see now this global effort to try and take down the First Amendment. And this is what we're going to dig into a little bit more now in this video on how Meghan and Harry were a part of this plan from the beginning. Meghan and Harry are part of this censorship industrial complex. With all the people that they are aligned with and giving money to, it's safe to say that they are definitely a part of it. One person that they have been aligned with from the beginning, since they left in 2020, was Renee DiResta. Now, if you're new to this channel and don't know who Renee DiResta is, she worked with Harry on the Aspen Commission on Information Disorder report. She also did a couple of conferences alongside with Harry. Remember the one with Wired in which Harry said that he knew about January 6th? And then let's not forget the Time 100 where Maria Ressa was also a part of that. In any case, Renee DiResta has now been caught up in a few lawsuits surrounding violation of First Amendment rights, one in Louisiana, one in Texas, and most notably the Missouri versus Biden lawsuit. Not a good place for this woman, but they still continue and they're still doing work. But as I said, the work that they're doing now has shifted to focusing on protecting the kids. Just a quick reminder from a video that I did about 9 months ago, I talk about Project Birmingham or Alabama Project, to which Renee DiResta was a part of. Here's what I said. Here is something you should know about her. A secret effort to influence the 2017 Senate election in Alabama used tactics inspired by Russian disinformation teams, including the creation of fake accounts to deliver misleading messages on Facebook to hundreds of thousands of voters to help elect Democrat Doug Jones in the deeply red state, according to a document obtained by the Washington Post. What is known about Project Birmingham is that its effort was a digital messaging operation to influence the outcome of the Alabama Senate race by targeting 650,000 likely voters with messages on social media platforms such as Facebook, while obscuring the fact that the messages were coming from an effort backing Jones. So according to Fox News, they say that Democratic operatives backed by a liberal billionaire and facilitated by a former Obama official created thousands of fake Russian accounts to give an impression the Russian government was supporting Alabama Republican Roy Moore in last year's election against now Senator Doug Jones. Up until now, Renee DiResta has denied that she had any involvement with this and said she had left the company before this situation took place. Well, looks like recollections might be varying here because Bombshell last Friday, Whistleblower has come forward to dispute Renee DiResta's participation in this Russian disinformation for that Senate election. Let's look at this article because it's very relevant to the behavior of what we've seen with the Sussex Squad and Mr. Bot Sentinel. Independent journalist Paul Thacker exposes this story, interviewing the whistleblower Betsy Dupree. He writes, in late 2018, the New York Times and Washington Post reported on a leaked document discussing a secret project by Democratic Party operatives that falsely accused Republican candidate Roy Moore of support by Russians while he was running in a tight race for the Senate in Alabama. The scheme linked the Moore campaign to thousands of Russian accounts on Twitter and drew national media attention. We orchestrated an elaborate false flag operation that planted the idea that the Moore campaign was amplified on social media by a Russian botnet, the New York Times reported, and the leaked documents stated. Oh, kind of like what we saw with Catherine and the conspiracies that were amplified by the Sussex Squad. You notice who the publications are. We have People Magazine, NBC News, we have Daily Beast, all the traditional left-wing media outlets from the United States who had been peddling this. Keep that in your mind. Also keep in mind a certain somebody that was featured on Netflix that was leading this. The documents linked a relatively unknown company called New Knowledge to the Alabama disinformation campaign. Although New Knowledge's chief executive, Jonathan Morgan, said the company was not involved and he worked on Project Birmingham in his personal capacity. Morgan also reached out at the time to Renee DiResta, a self-styled expert on disinformation, who told the New York Times she disagreed with such tactics and later joined New Knowledge sometime, but only after Project Birmingham ended. So remember, in early 2023, Matt Taibbi released the Twitter files and drop about Hamilton 68, which was a public dashboard created by New Knowledge, the company that Renee DiResta was working at. Hamilton 68 tracked hundreds of Twitter accounts to monitor the spread of purported pro-Russian propaganda online, but screenshots of emails sent by former Twitter executive Yoel Roth voiced alarm that the dashboard was creating, not tracking disinformation. Where have we seen a tool that tracks accounts? Even more specifically, single-purpose hate accounts. Any ideas, folks? Anyone? Oh, who remembers this little tracker that was put on the Megxit accounts? But getting back to this bombshell that was dropped, the author goes into saying, starting a month ago, I began discussing what the media got wrong about New Knowledge and Hamilton 68 with Betsy Dupuis, a former New Knowledge employee who worked on Hamilton 68. Dupuis tells me she was fired from New Knowledge after expressing misgivings upon discovering the company that branded itself the world's first platform for defending online communities from social media manipulation was itself engaging in blatant social media manipulation. Ooh, boy. To back up her claims, Dupuis provided internal documents and photos from her time at New Knowledge, as well as screenshots of text messages. Some of those we are publishing today. New Knowledge poached Dupuis from another company and set her to work improving the Hamilton 68 dashboard, which was planned as a product for groups aligned with the Democratic Party. The development was underwritten with a year of funding by the Center for American Progress, a think tank and lobby shop run by political party operatives. Dupuis says she enjoyed her work updating Hamilton 68, but she became concerned when people in the office discussed the Alabama project, and she began wondering if this had anything to do with Roy Moore, a Republican candidate running for Senate. When she had joined the company, Jonathan Morgan had assured her that New Knowledge would only monitor, never create disinformation. But then several former employees from the National Security Agency, or NSA, joined New Knowledge. Out for company drinks, former NSA employees explained to Dupuis how agencies get around federal laws that ban the U.S. government from spying on and censoring Americans. They contract with companies like New Knowledge to do their dirty work. By the time New Knowledge announced they had secured a Department of Defense contract to create automated disinformation, Dupuis had had enough. She met with Jonathan Morgan to discuss her concerns and was fired days later. Dupuis says that neither Jonathan Morgan nor Stanford's Renee DiResta have come clean with journalists about what happened in Alabama to create disinformation during an American election. But she says she is tired of being scared, and the time has come for her to speak up. Silence doesn't buy you safety, Dupuis says. People will still come after you because of what you know. Dupuis goes on to talk about why she chose to work for New Knowledge, and she was stating that she was at an oil and gas data analytics company and was mostly working as a designer building the front end of the software. So it wasn't super advanced stuff for her, and she was fine with going to New Knowledge when they reached out because they were ready to immediately hire her. And she thought that they were interested in her because she was able to do some of this programming and visualization stuff. And for them at New Knowledge, that was really all they were looking for. It wasn't about doing any kind of disinformation stuff. So Paul Thacker then goes into asking her if she researched the company before or understood the politics that they were in. And she had said no, she didn't know what they, were about. And as far as her political affiliation, she wasn't defined as one or the other, Democrat, Republican. It was pretty much across the spectrum and looked at both sides. Politics wasn't a big deal for her. But then Thacker asks, of course, you knew about Russian disinformation and Trump because that's all the media wrote for 4 years. And she responds back, yes, but it wasn't something I really followed. I just wanted to have intelligent conversations about what was in the news. New Knowledge told me they do all this stuff with disinformation. Jonathan had some State Department role under the Obama administration. Sandy was a friend from high school or something from their time in Houston. He was the chief technical officer. I guess you know how that works, right? Thacker responds, well, no. From what I understand about the tech industry, people get these jobs they're not really qualified for, but they know someone or have some weird skill that nobody else has in the office. The programming guy who likes talking to people can suddenly become head of marketing. I get the sense that titles are very nebulous in tech startups. Dupuy responds, Sandy had a degree, and I think he was serious about being a tech guy, but I don't think he had the work experience to be a CTO. But that's often the case at startups. They told me about their funding and trying to get all these contracts with companies that were doing this disinformation thing. I had a vague idea about this stuff from what I was reading about Trump and just from being online for so long. People make stuff up. But they said they were going to build this AI tool, and I was kind of skeptical. I previously worked at a company that had done some AI thing back in 2013. A lot of times people tell you they have artificial intelligence to do some chore, but it's really just a bunch of humans doing all the work, which is really expensive. Eventually, you get found out. Further down, Dupuy says these companies pretend to have computer automated intelligence, but it's a sham. Real people do the work because they don't know how to make software good enough to automate the task. Well, isn't that interesting? You mean to tell me that people who make these trackers don't really know how to use AI or machine learning for it to detect this kind of stuff, such as hate and misinformation, disinformation? Oh, say it ain't so. Sorry, I digress. Back to the article. So I was a little bit skeptical of that, but they had all these PhDs, so maybe they could make it work. I asked, hey, will you guys ever want to do disinformation? And they said, no, it's completely against our ethics. I also asked if they were only going to point out disinformation whenever Republicans do it or when both sides do it. And they said, we're bipartisan. In fact, we have Republicans that we've worked with for a long time. So Thacker asked this question: how was their business set up? Who was funding them? DARPA. Jonathan had gotten his seed money from DARPA, and he had actually been through several iterations of trying to get the company off the ground. Apparently, a whole other set of co-founders had left the company. I can't remember why. He had a podcast called Partially Derivative and some nonprofit organization called Data for Democracy. There was a weird thing with people in the office, people that weren't in the office, people working as contractors. Some of the contractors had this aura around them, the same as what I've heard of Renee DiResta. We're just really passionate about disinformation. One contractor was just involved in building scrapers. So to explain what trackers are, Dupuy goes into saying, instead of having a person go and copy-paste everything from a website, you use a computer that collects all the data. I knew someone who had a scraping company that the State Department, FBI, and other agencies use, and they could have saved a lot of money using him. Instead, they hired this contractor to learn how to scrape Twitter. Twitter kept denying new knowledge access to scrape because it costs them money when you're pulling too much data, and they didn't have an established partnership. New knowledge was using a lot of their bandwidth. So understand that the API into Twitter was allowing them access to scrape the data and pull it in order to create these trackers on hate and mis and disinformation. Follow me here? Ever since Elon Musk bought over the company, he then started charging this enormous amount of money per month for companies to be able to scrape that kind of data. Hence the reason why a lot of these scraping apps that would do social network analysis or, capture data for these trackers are no longer working anymore. So Thacker then goes in to ask Betsy about what it was like working on the Hamilton 68 dashboard. And she goes into explaining that this dashboard was the first iteration, didn't look too well. And the ultimate goal of what New Knowledge was trying to do was to get it sold to the Center for American Progress, or CAP. And just so you know, the Center for American Progress, CAP, is a Democratic Party think tank and lobby shop. They're most famous for being the ones who basically ran Hillary Clinton's campaign in 2016. But more importantly, Simon Clark is a former member of CAP who now chairs the Center for Countering Digital Hate, or CCDH. This CCDH with Imran Ahmed, who is the Stop Hate for Profit campaign that Meghan and Harry were a part of back in 2020. Yeah, that group, a bogus disinformation group that works closely with the Biden administration. But what people need to know is that this Hamilton 68 dashboard has been funded, you guessed it, by the American taxpayer, as the nonprofits that were giving money to get this work done then used it to then track American citizens. So Thacker then goes into asking, what did this upgraded Hamilton 68 allow them to do? And Betsy responds, they could observe emerging trends on Twitter, trending hashtags, trending topics, and track what people were linking to. She continues to explain that the alt-right was a big topic at the time. They would take a list of Twitter accounts and they would say that these are alt-right. And then you would watch what was coming up. If something like China came up, you would see that there was top trending topic for the day. And it would be a different topic every day that would come up because they were constantly scraping Twitter and constantly refreshing and updating this data. The conversation continues, and Thacker says, so they could monitor social media based on how they categorize people to see what they were talking about. Dupuy answers, but they were not very diligent with their methodologies. Output would change when you redefine who is alt-right or who is a conspiracy theorist. That would change who fits the category. Betsy replies, yes, this happened on a weekly basis. None of this was ever public on Hamilton 68, which was the public, ugly version. This was happening on the pretty version I was building, and that was going to be the new product. The new version was going to be sold as a disinformation monitoring service with a dashboard for internal security people. Then Thacker says, if they're interested in monitoring disinformation, did you notice them ever monitoring disinformation put out by lefties or by Antifa? Anything like that? How did that work internally? So many have asked the same question as to why Bot Sentinel didn't include any of the Sussex Squad. Was it because they were a part of BLM and Antifa? Just some food for thought. Betsy then replies, internally, everybody there was very Democrat. They were very partisan focused. They were also focused on some pretty extreme people, neo-Nazis, people associated with the Triple K, obviously reprehensible people. And Thacker then asks, were they targeting Bernie Sanders type people? Dupuy says, no, it was all really extreme people or Republican stuff. And for a time, they adjusted the dashboard to follow stuff about Roy Moore. That must have aligned with the time period that they were doing the disinformation campaign against Roy Moore. Now, for those that don't remember, Roy Moore was the Republican running for the Senate in Alabama. Betsy then says the dashboard I was building that the Center for American Progress, otherwise known as CAP, funded was in effect measuring the outcome of New Knowledge's, this is the company that Renee DiResta worked at, disinformation campaign against Roy Moore, who is a reprehensible person. This was something I was concerned about with joining the company. We want to be objective. They were offering an equity in the company, and I didn't want the company to ruin their own reputation, which they did. Thacker then says, so you could see that partisanship, lack of being objectivity was possibly going to take the whole company down. Betsy says, I saw it before I even joined the company. It was obviously partisan, but I figured as long as we're going after neo-Nazis, I definitely hate neo-Nazis. Now, what she says here is interesting, but how much of neo-Nazi data was just what they were creating? So she was essentially saying, look, they were making up all of this stuff and then funneling it to the dashboard. So a couple things I just want to point out here. Do you see how naive this girl was, fresh out of college, taking this job on, thinking she's going to make this impact, optimistic, and here we have this company doing some underhanded, dirty, shady things in the name of so-called democracy. This is exactly what I see with Meghan and Harry and Archewell in targeting the youth and how they're using them to do their dirty, underhanded business in whether it be censorship or corruption, you name it, all very dirty. Also, I'd like to add is, do you also see the similarity of how this underhanded business of creating this mess to make it look like it was Russia, only for it to be the very same people who are so-called fighting disinformation? I mean, look, Meghan and Harry found the right crew to do this with. So next, Betsy explains that Ryan Fox joins and explains that he spent 10 years in NSA, to which she then says that Jonathan Morgan announced that they hired that guy from out of town, and Ryan previously worked at NSA, which was a big departure from everybody else in the office who was from the tech industry, a PhD, or from a think tank. Nobody was from the government, and she says, to my knowledge, except John Morgan, had done some consulting with the State Department and got DARPA money. But Ryan Fox is a former NSA agent, and this is not what I signed up for. We were building a company focusing on disinformation services for the corporate world. We were doing image consulting for companies, basically. They announced he's going to have the title of co-founder, and he was like flying in once a week or so while I was there. Thacker then asks, he's important enough that they'll hire him to fly in once a week and call him a co-founder. He's that critical to this small startup company. What was he bringing to the table? And Betsy replies, the way he explained it to me, he had experience with intelligence analyst kind of stuff. He didn't really have any programming experience. I guess he was bringing contracts and this disinformation research. I knew how to take data and put it into a product, so it makes sense to users. But with this disinformation stuff, I didn't know what the F they were talking about sometimes. I didn't understand how they were going to build an AI to get at disinformation like a human. Betsy then goes on to say, the way Ryan explained it to me is he would go into 4chan and these chat groups, befriending some of these people, get invited to some like Slack channel. He was generally scrolling through the dark web and looking for people trying to create conspiracies or engage in disinformation mischief. They were trying to infiltrate those communities to identify what they were doing before they actually got out a message. Now, pause, folks. If you've been around this community for the last 5 years and know about Yankee Wally and what happened to her, as well as some other Megxiteers in this community who had been deplatformed, censored, harassed, you would know that there were people like Sarah Data and her little minions that did infiltrate the Megxit group. But this gets better. Let me continue on. So Thacker asked, did the company change when he came on board, meaning this guy, Ryan Fox? Betsy replies, I don't think anything changed, although this was around the time that Jonathan Morgan was talking my ear off about how much he hated Roy Moore, meaning that senator from Alabama. Like, he felt he needed to convince me that this guy was awful. And Jonathan is the person that ended up doing the disinformation campaign against Roy Moore, while I was concurrently working on the dashboard to measure the disinformation campaign against Roy Moore. So essentially, it sounds like Jonathan was behind the scenes creating some bots and fake news articles to go ahead and push out as if it was Russian disinformation. Okay, as it continues, this is what I can gather from news articles that later came out. It's hard for me to place exactly because they would use code words for things and they would talk about the Birmingham Project and Alabama Project. At the time, I didn't know exactly what they were talking about. I knew to some extent it was about measuring what was going on in that Roy Moore election. It all seemed pretty arbitrary, but they were defining disinformation and their methodology for measuring this stuff, how they built communities. And Thacker asks, by community, do you mean the 6,000 users they might define as neo-Nazis or the 5,500 users they might call conspiracy theorists? And Betsy replies, communities means definition and distinctions we have. To say these are the group of people that we think is doing disinformation and we're tracking them. Now, it all makes sense as to why Samantha and all of us were grouped together as these middle aged white women who were housewives and, as you can see here, apparently uneducated and racist. So, next, Thacker asks, how did they define these people? If you read the news, it's hard to understand how certain people get placed into groups. I can't tell you the number of physicians I've spoken to since this pandemic started who've told me they've been called right wing or MAGA, and they're like, I've never voted Republican. I hate Trump. Why are they calling me this? These definitions in the disinformation field are so fluid as to be nonsensical. Now, if you don't support sending more money to Ukraine, you're a Putin backer or Russian disinformation or racist in the case of Meghan Markle. What was Renee DiResta's involvement? She seems to have been a principal. At least she was looped in on these emails from New Knowledge to Twitter that I found, although the people at Twitter wanted nothing to do with her. One Twitter executive referred to DiResta as a disinformation hobbyist, and Yoel Roth worked to steer people away from her and back to safer territory. God, she sounds just as irritating and annoying as Meghan. Now, here's what Betsy said about her. She's kind of had a very loose relationship, and I think she officially became an employee around February 2018, meaning working at New Knowledge. I remember her being in the office in early March during South by Southwest, the festival that Meghan was just at, that the CIA goes to, where she was a speaker. She had been offered a free badge, but she didn't want to go the other days, so she wanted to give me her badge. She had this New York Times article written about her. She was bragging about how it created an aura of mystery around her work, and she was like, we need to set a tone inside the company that we are undercover sleuths. When I thought about the company's marketing, I was more thinking about traditional problem solving for customers. She and Morgan wanted the tone to be dark, scary, and grungy. But you don't have to scare people to sell them on a product. You can be assertive, friendly, and positive and explain how you can fix something. Thacker then asks, this was the New York Times article I found that Twitter executive were trying to steer the reporter away from DiResta. It was very overwrought, so I can see why DiResta likes talking about it. Did she move to Austin, or how did that work? Betsy replies, well, she lived in San Francisco, and I think it was just Zoom meetings and talking remote. She was supposed to be working on marketing, but she just struck me as having a really big ego. I thought she said she worked for the FBI, but then I found out it was CIA. She had an internship at the CIA and she didn't like it, but she laughed like she was too good to work at the CIA. Like we must ask the question, like, what's in the water in California? Because all these people are so delusional. So Thacker continues on and says, did you get a sense of what she did with the company, or were you not in those meetings? And Betsy replies, I knew she was working on the Alabama project, even though she's given various statements that conflict with her real involvement. I wasn't working on the Alabama project, so I didn't know the details. The public name was Project Birmingham, but I remember them saying Alabama Project more often. She was working on the Alabama project, and so was Ryan and Jonathan. I was working on making the dashboard better, but I wonder now if that was all a charade to give the company an air of legitimacy. Thacker asks, legitimacy as what? To make us look like a software company. I felt the software team wasted a lot of time naming their microservices, these tiny parts of the software. Everything would have to be a dumb acronym, and they had a whole Slack channel for this, wasting hours of time. I participated because I wanted to be sociable, but yeah, there was just a lot of like effing around. Well, isn't that great to know, wasting American taxpayer dollars? Thacker then asks, while they were doing the Alabama project and you're working to improve the Hamilton 68 dashboard, did you realize they were connected? Betsy replies, kind of, because they wanted more and more about Roy Moore in the dashboard and things related to him. Sounds kind of like Meghan Markle. In hindsight, I can tell you what they were measuring. They were measuring their own bot disinformation activity. Wait, what? You don't say. Ain't that some shit? Anyhow, Betsy continues and says that's what they were measuring when Roy Moore was the subject of the dashboard. And Thacker asks, this Alabama project or Project Birmingham comes out later in the New York Times. What did you see? Did you realize in real time that New Knowledge was putting out disinformation on Roy Moore while he was running for Senate? Or did it hit you when it came out in the New York Times? You don't always know what's going on inside your own office. To which Betsy says, I wish I had written more stuff down. At one point, we had all these new Elasticsearch NSA people show up. They're an open source proprietary search technology API that can be integrated into software. It's used by a lot of companies. I've never worked anywhere that hasn't had some sort of Elasticsearch type tool embedded into the product. And I'm sure a certain bot company that we all know that had been scraping data on the Megxit community most likely used it. In any case, we already had one NSA person join, Ryan, and that made sense because he's a security analyst, and it sounded like he was excited to get out of working for the government. But then we got a new executive that had previously worked at the NSA, and he came from Elastic. But this second NSA guy became the director of technology or something. When he comes in, we go down to the Draft House, this bar down the street from the office, for a kind of employee welcome thing. Ryan gets really drunk. This is Ryan Fox, NSA guy. He didn't seem to be able to hold his liquor, and I started asking him about PRISM. Thacker then responds, this was the top secret NSA program to spy on Americans that Edward Snowden leaked to Glenn Greenwald. PRISM allowed intelligence services direct access to the company servers to search our communications. Member of Congress didn't even know it existed. Betsy continues on and says, I didn't say anything about how I felt about it. I was just wondering what it was like to be working at the NSA when it got blown up by Edward Snowden. And he said, that exposed the locations and identities of people that were undercover and put their lives at risk. I thought that was a pretty reasonable thing to be upset about. And then Ryan and other former NSA guy are kind of bantering back and forth and saying, oh, it's not like what people think it is. We actually have to really follow the law, follow the Constitution. But a lot of people get fed up with that and leave to go into the private sector. Because if you sell it back as a product to the government, you're not bound to federal law. Well, isn't that something? Good to know. So, just for clarification purposes, Thacker then chimes in and says, they were willing to tell you what the game is. The game is you work inside NSA or these intelligence agencies. You then leave the intel agencies and you go work in the private sector. And then you sell the information right back to your old employer in the federal government. Wow. I wonder how much money Harry has been making off of our federal government selling information back to the UK. Do you think that he's doing that? Maybe he's playing both sides of the coin, selling information to the United States, selling his family up the river, and then getting secrets from the United States and selling them over to the UK. This guy should be subpoenaed to Congress to answer a couple questions, don't you think? No wonder why he's so gung-ho to get his IPP status back. It's to have access to that intelligence and data. Now, this next part is very disturbing. So Thacker asks, you're just some tech person who's never really interacted with government people, and you're learning all this stuff about how the NSA works and private contractors. What was going through your mind? And Betsy replies, the guy from Elastic, he was explaining to me that Elasticsearch is basically the public arm of the NSA, which is a little bit disturbing because Elastic is used everywhere. And while Elastic is an open source technology, there could be, in theory, be a backdoor. This would be unlikely, though. And Thacker says, when this guy tells you that Elastic is essentially the NSA in the private sector, was this something that's well known? Betsy replies, when I asked around, I found that people know about this. Thacker says, but it's not well known. So you've got Ryan Fox and eventually 10 other former NSA guys joined from Elastic, and they're now working at New Knowledge. What is New Knowledge trying to do? What is the company about? Betsy then replies, this was right around the time I got fired. We had this all-hands meeting where they discussed that they had successfully run a disinformation campaign and announced that the Department of Defense was funding us, New Knowledge, to build a disinformation propagation platform. Thacker then says, a bunch of former NSA guys get hired, and DoD throws a contract at you to create automated disinformation. What goes through your head at this point? Betsy then says, I contacted a friend, and it's pretty clear from my text message thread, oh man, I need a different job. They want to build a weaponized disinformation project for the government. They're talking about creating a tool to allow the government to manipulate the perception of their own elections. Let that sink in for a second. And all that I've been telling you about Meghan and Harry's interference in the 2020 election and their plan to do it again. But wait, folks, Thacker drives this point home by clarifying and saying, they are actually discussing inside the company that the DoD is funding them to manipulate American elections? Betsy then says, yes, like I said about the Alabama project, I had been overhearing things for months in the office about the DoD project. I would just hear something Alabama project or DoD project. Most of the time, it didn't really have anything to do with what I was working on. So I was just like, whatever. There was a lot of chaos in the office, so I was just getting things through osmosis and what I overheard. Thacker then says, who is lead on the DoD thing? And Dupuy says, I think that was more Jonathan Morgan and Ryan Fox. Thacker then says, forget it's the DoD now funding them. They don't see it's a problem that they're creating a program to manipulate American elections? That's totally different from creating tools to confuse the Russians or some South American country about their elections. Now, knowing all of this and having the background and what we all went through, and Harry's alignment with all of the very same people that are now getting sued for censoring Americans, you have to think, how deep is he in with our government? Because, look, he's running this Invictus show and they're down to 2 locations, one being Washington, D.C. And why is it that the United States government does not want to disclose Harry's visa information? Okay, I'm going to pause right here and just let you process this information, because believe me, it does take a moment to finally understand the gravity and seriousness of what this group or this network or industrial complex has done, and understand that the things that we kept questioning as to like, why is it that the royal family didn't do anything in 2020 when Meghan and Harry were sticking their tentacles into our government? You have to question, was this whole entire thing one big psyops to get us to look over here, but not look over there, while this situation here in America with the administration that was running for a second term couldn't get elected again? Really ask yourself this question based off of what we've seen over the last 3.5 years go down with these globalists. Keep in mind, the British royal family is a part of the World Economic Forum. I can't be an apologist for these people just because they have their PR positioning themselves as innocent and have no involvement with it. I don't believe for 1 second that Charles didn't know what his son was coming over here to do and who he was aligning with. You can't tell me that they came over here and the British royal family had no idea what their plans were. I call bullshit on all of that. I mean, honestly, we talk so much about like Meghan having blackmail over this family. Well, perhaps maybe the blackmail is this situation, and perhaps maybe, and this is just a possibility, I don't know, this is me speculating. What if the royal family knew about Harry's business affairs coming over here to the United States and the mission that he was supposed to complete? What if Harry's mission was to come over here to undermine the First Amendment and our Constitution? Because obviously their activities and the alignment with the people that they've been working with, as well as our government, kind of speaks big volumes, but nobody seems to be paying attention or taking it seriously that this had been going on. And slowly but surely, your rights are being taken away, as is. Many of you tell me, oh, my comment disappeared. Wait for it, folks. It's going to get worse if we sit back and do nothing. Now, if you made it this far, I have to say thank you. I really appreciate you sticking it through. If you could do me the favor, help the kid out and like this video. Maybe YouTube might recommend it to 1 or 2 people. I don't know if they do that anymore because from the, what everybody's been saying and me paying attention, yeah, I do believe that the channel is suppressed. And, we all understand why. We all understand which side YouTube is playing on, and fair enough. But the fact is, I'm not going to stop talking about this because what they are doing is wrong. And what they were involved with and still are involved with is wrong. And this is why I call on Jim Jordan to subpoena Prince Harry to Congress, because I think America needs to know how he knew about January 6th, as well as an explanation as his involvement with Aspen and all these other people and NGOs that he's been given money to in favor of censorship. I think it's a fair thing. But in any case, what do you guys think? I know this is a lot. Definitely leave your thoughts below. As always, I will be back with more content. But until then, please be safe, and I'll talk to you later. Bye.
You're such a fraud.